It kind of seems like we live in an age of endless reboots, never-ending franchises, and universes that just won't quit. And honestly, it kind of makes you take for granted the idea of collective imagination. Those big, sprawling worlds that aren't owned by just one author, but shaped by dozens and dozens of writers, designers, directors, and even fans over time. And that's not a bad thing. It's actually kind of beautiful watching different people and even entire generations reinterpret the same characters, the same stories through a totally new lens. But it all got me thinking, where did that all start? Well, maybe not start, but Dragonlance has to be one of the earliest and most fascinating examples. Born out of Dungeons & Dragons in the 1980s, Dragonlance exploded into one of the most beloved shared fantasy universes ever, spawning hundreds of novels, game modules, comics, and much, much more. And yet, despite all of that, Dragonlance has always felt like a bit of a cult classic. Sure, it's wildly influential, but also strangely overlooked, which is weird because this series has everything. Epic battles between armies of dragons, love triangles, warring gods, and even a Greco-Roman empire of minotaurs, which is amazing. But the wild thing about this is that Dragonlance very nearly almost didn't happen. And once it did, its history has been wild, full of dramatic ups and downs, legal chaos, canceled adaptations, the works. So in this video, we're going to explore what Dragonlance actually is, the insane journey it's been on over the decades, its many adaptations, and where things stand today to explore whatever happened to Dragonlance. Hi everyone, my name is Otto and welcome to Exits Examined. In this channel, we'll be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. If that sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below, and I want to give an enormous shout out to my patrons who make this channel possible. Thank you. Dragonlance is a lot of things. It's a beloved book series, a sprawling D&D setting, a world full of epic dragon battles, derpy hobo dwarves, edgelord wizards, and if you're new to Dragonlance, it can be a lot. Between all the additions, hundreds of novels, and lore, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. But simply put, Dragonlance is a Dungeons & Dragons setting that launched way back in 1984 that quickly morphed into a best-selling book series that arguably outshined the game itself. And the very core of Dragonlance is that it is a good old classic sword and sorcery. And I mean this in the best possible way, the very dictionary definition of tropey. But it leans into that tropeness. Quest, magic, and dragons. So many dragons, and it works. Sure, the central story might sound familiar, a ragtag group of adventurers reunites in a world teetering on the edge of doom, but that simplicity is its strength. This is pure classic D&D, heroic, high stakes, and the setting feels warm and familiar and just easy to get into. But let's not get too comfortable in here because although the world can feel familiar and cozy at times, in order to tell that grand epic story, you need, well, epic stakes. And in order to have that, bad needs to happen. And it actually might be surprising to some people out there, but Dragonlance is technically a post-apocalyptic world. So back in the good old days of the world known as Kryn, those cocky, swarmy mortals were being a bit too cocky and swarmy. And the gods do what they do best and decided to take them down a peg or two in the only logical way gods know how. Fiery, apocalyptic mayhem and casting a fiery mountain down on the lands. That'll teach him, right? Anyway, the scars of the cataclysm, as it's known, are still very much being felt, and the world, even hundreds of years later, is still a bit of a mess. Now, although the world is harsh, there is hope and order, with my personal favorite being the Knights of Salamnia. These guys are the chivalric order of the setting, dedicated to honor, justice, and serving the gods of good. They've got a long and messy history, and crucially, they're not perfect. Sometimes they're hopelessly political, other times a bit too idealistic, but when they work, they work. They are tenacious to a fault, and sure, you could call them idealistic and naive, but these guys do not around, and there is a reason that their order has been kicking around for ages upon ages. Even putting the fact that they produce some of the most hardcore heroes of the setting aside, these guys are a capital M military order and know how to fight with tactics, strategy, and can and will adapt. And these guys will not back down. Many of the knights have lost limbs from countless campaigns, but in the books, they're still just as up for some incredibly insane high-risk mission. Now, they put their code before everything, which is called the Measure. Basically, a massive, borderline fanatical rulebook that all knights must swear by. And at the heart of it is their insanely epic motto, "My honor is my life." And when things get real, like evil hordes charging at you, evil gods scheming, and dragons raining down fire, these are the guys that I want at my back. But with the good comes the bad, and in this case, I mean that quite literally. One of the most fascinating things about Dragonlance is the idea of balance, which isn't just a theme, it's the actual foundation of the universe. The world was created on what's known as the Great Triangle, representing the forces of good, evil, and neutrality. Now, these three cosmic powers are in constant tension, with the god of good, Paladine, always fighting against the goddess of evil, Takesis. And this idea of balance doesn't just sit in the background. Even some of the central characters in the setting, including Tanis, Lorana, and Kitiara, are written to reflect the different sides of the moral spectrum. And this idea of alignment is even baked into the world's magic system, with wizards aligning themselves with one of the magical paths, and they wear colored robes to match it. So you got white for good, red for neutral, and black for evil, which original, I know. And it's not just aesthetic. Your alignment affects your role, your spellcasting philosophy, and even your magical powers. And throughout all of this, you really get a sense that Dragonlance has this cyclical nature. Gods fall and rise again, magic shifts, breaks, and reforms, dragons vanish for a while, then come back angry. It's kind of a world where history is on this grand, often tragic kind of rerun. Take Huma Dragonbane, which is a strong name, right? Anyway, he's a legendary knight who rose up to face off against the dark goddess Takesis and her army of dragons, wielding the fabled Dragonlance. His story becomes a myth that inspires new heroes, and so on with this cyclical nature. Good versus evil across time and generations. Oh, and in case you're wondering, well, what actually is a Dragonlance? Yeah, that is a fair question, considering this whole world is named after it. In layman's terms, it's a big old magic spear to mess up dragons. Yes, it's technically blessed by gods or forged in sacred fire or whatever, but let's be real, it's an anti-dragon stick. Feels kind of important to mention for a video on, Dragonlance. And speaking of dragons, I mean, how could we not? It's right there twice in the title. Dragonlance is serious about its dragons. You got dragons to fight, dragons to ride, dragons by the boatloads. They're also divided, shockingly, by, you guessed it, alignment, which I know I'll give you a second to recover from that plot twist. Now, the evil dragons come in classic chromatic colors: red, blue, green, black, white, while the good ones are metallic: gold, silver, bronze, brass, and copper. But it's not just a paint job. Each type has its own personality, fighting style, and backstory. Although the one thing that ties them together is dragon seppuku, which is not a combination of words I'd ever thought would exist, but here we are. Now, crucially, Dragonlance isn't just dragons, because there's actually a shockingly large amount of just unique, weird stuff thrown in here too. For example, it's also home to one of the most eclectic and surprisingly well-developed collections of fantasy races in D&D. Take, for example, everyone's favorite Greco-Roman Minotaur naval empire, which I don't care if you are 14 or 44, if that idea doesn't hype you up, I do not know what will. And then you got the Gully Dwarfs, who are the fantasy equivalent of dwarven raccoon people, and I have a massive soft spot for. Grimy, chaotic, and often described as hobo dwarves, which I absolutely love, and famously have a very difficult time counting even to 3, and I'd be remiss to not bring up one of the most infamous races in the setting, which are the Kinder. You either love them or want to launch them into the sun. These halfling-adjacent wanderers are immune to fear and driven by terminal curiosity. They don't steal, no, they find. So they might look into someone else's coin pouch strictly out of curiosity and boredom, you see, with the fullest intentions of returning anything they borrowed. And that is just scratching the surface. There are hill dwarves, mountain dwarves, dark dwarves, sea elves, wild elves, dark elves, centaurs, ogres, and all of them have just as much lore behind them. The world isn't just populated, it feels lived in, and every race has a surprisingly detailed backstory and history. Now, although that's all well and good, the reason Dragonlance carved out a permanent seat at the fantasy table isn't just the dragons or the sprawling world building, it's of course the characters. The companions didn't just define the setting, setting, they pretty much were the setting. From day one, Dragonlance flipped the script by giving us pre-made characters with fully formed personalities, flaws, ideals, and messy dynamics. These weren't blank slate adventurers waiting to be filled in by players at the table. No. They were narrative forces of nature baked into both the novels and even the game modules. And the story starts with something simple but universal. A group of friends promising to meet again at their hometown after 5 years apart. Now, these were relatable. Most of them didn't even break level 4 to start. No piles of loot, no enchanted equipment. They kind of felt like the characters you could roll up at your table, but with actual depth and arcs. Now, of course, we got the patron saint of edgy mages, Raistlin Magir, who is one of the author's favorites for a reason. He's physically frail, emotionally scarred, and my man is sarcastic, and also at times extremely selfish, but somehow still manages to surprise you with rare flashes of compassion. And as his perfect opposite, you've got Sturm Brightblade, the most painfully noble knight you'll ever meet. He's honorable to a fault, tragically rigid, and wears his father's armor like it's sacred. He's basically lawful good in human form in the best and worst ways. And the rest of companions are just as vivid. Canis, torn between worlds and romances, Caramon, the big-hearted twin forever struggling with his brother's shadow, Tico with a frying pan and something to prove, Goldmoon and Riverwind and Flint and Tasselhoff providing the heart and humor and yes, chaos that keeps the whole thing from falling apart. They feel like a real adventuring party, with grudges, jokes, unspoken tensions. They laugh together, and you get a sense that they're sick of each other's but still fight and mourn together. And that's why when the story punches you in the guts, and believe me, it will, it usually lands. And even the peripheral characters are great, with a special shout out to everyone's favorite bumbling wizard, Fizban, who has some of the greatest D&D quotes. Quote, Raistlin ran to Fizban's side. Now is the time for the casting of the fireball, old one, he panted. It is? Fizban's face filled with delight. Wonderful. How does it go? Don't you remember? Raistlin practically shrieked, dragging the mage behind a pillar as the slug spat another glob of burning saliva onto the floor. End quote. But after saying all that, here's the catch. That level of emotional investment came at a cost. The original characters were so beloved, so intertwined with the setting that Dragonlance kind of trapped itself. Later authors struggled to break out of their shadows because when your characters are that good, they kind of don't just define the world, they become the world. So how did all of this start? Well, it's impossible to mention Dragonlance without mentioning its creator, Tracy Hickman, who has one crazy resume. Apparently, he had a background working in a grocery store, running a cinema projector, driving a school bus, worked in a photo darkroom, and even spent 2 years as a missionary in Java. And fun fact, Dragonlance magic system ended up half inspired by Indonesian spellwords. Anyway, Tracy's wife, Laura, introduced him to D&D, and he would go on to self-publish some early D&D modules. Now, TSR, the company behind Dungeons & Dragons at the time, caught wind of them and allegedly called Tracy and basically said, we're either going to sue you or hire you. So, the answer was obvious, and on the car ride to his interview, Tracy and Laura came up with a few ideas for D&D settings, with the main one basically being, what if we, actually put dragons back into Dungeons & Dragons? And this actually was kind of a novel idea, which does sound insane, I know, but at the time there were shockingly few dragons in Dungeons & Dragons, which feels bizarre to say, and TSR must have thought so too. Now, at the time, they were desperate for a big new product line because they were in the middle of some rough financial waters, and they tasked Hickman and others with creating a grand dragon-centric product, something much more than just a module. They wanted novels, miniatures, calendars, art, the whole high fantasy buffet. And this project was very dramatically named Project Overlord. And this of course would take way more than just game designers, and this of course brings us to Margaret Weiss. Now at the time she was working at TSR as an editor, and her job was to find someone to write the Dragonlance novels, but hiring a good writer who could work cheap and also play nice with D&D canon was not exactly easy. Now eventually, after reading a rough draft from another writer, Weiss and Hickman seemingly looked at each other and basically said, wait, why don't we just do this ourselves? And that's exactly exactly what they did, basing a lot of the writing off their own gaming sessions and characters they made themselves, which is so wholesome. Importantly, they also collaborated with artist Larry Elmore, with some of his cover art directly inspiring events from the books. And let's be honest, that aesthetic is pure, unfiltered fantasy cheese in the best possible way. Big swords and bigger hair, it's all great stuff. Now, the wild part about this is that the Dragonlance novels at the time were kind of seen as a gimmick. Now, sure, TSR was happy with Weiss and Hickman's work, but like no one was really banking on these being successful because the main thing in everyone's eyes was the actual game. So the publisher only agreed to print the first book with a minimum print run, and as Weiss put it, quote, "All we got were people continually telling us it would fail," end quote. But then it dropped and it sold, baby. We're talking eventually millions of copies, which was all the more impressive because this was purely from word of mouth. Speaking of the writing, how good are the books? Well, to be perfectly honest, they're pulpy, often cheesy, and occasionally clunky, and yet somehow completely charming. And if you can take them at face value, they are a fun ride, and probably got thousands and thousands of kids into fantasy, myself included. So reading about epic fantasy battles is great, but playing through them is even better. And if you want dice that look as epic as the worlds you play in or read about, let me introduce you to a company that takes dice seriously. Like really seriously. Baron of Dice creates some of the most beautiful, high-quality dice out there, perfect for your next gaming session, your favorite wargame, or even just as a gift for that very lucky nerd in your life. Their hand-swirled resin dice are heavy and precision engraved with designs that span from everything from classic fantasy to deep space and grimdark war zones. Trust me, if you're into Dragonlance, Warhammer, or just love a good crit roll, they've got a set that will speak to your soul. Now, I love working with companies that are genuinely passionate about the tabletop community and fandom, and these folks are in it for the love of the game. So check out the link below, use the discount code on screen, and treat yourself to some of the most gorgeous dice that are out there. Okay, back to the video. Now, I'm willing to bet the majority, not all mind you, but the majority of people's first exposure to Dragonlance was not through the games, but through the novels, which makes sense because they are great books for what they are, and a few of these went on to become bestsellers. And oh yeah, there are literally truckloads of these bad boys. So many, it's hard to even put an exact number on. Now, there's roughly around 200, which probably comfortably puts it on the list of longest fantasy book series that ever existed. And all in all, Dragonlance has sold around 30 million books, which is not too shabby for a series that started as a literal afterthought for a D&D campaign. Now, of course, it all kicked off in 1984 with Dragons of Autumn Twilight, which was the first book in what would become the Chronicles trilogy. Now, is it the best book ever written in the world? Probably not, but quickly found their stride, and the rest of the Chronicles series was pretty good, and then they pivoted to the Legends series, which became the first TSR book to break into the New York Times bestseller list, and to this day, you'll see fans say that this is the high point of the series. Now, these first 6 books are the Rosetta Stone of Dragonlance, and if you want to understand what a Dragonlance novel is, this is the starting point, because these pretty much set the tone, style, and stakes for everything that followed. And after that first batch took off, TSR realized they had struck gold. The only problem is that Weiss and Hickman were very inconveniently human, and the thing about those gosh darn authors is that they very inconveniently can only write so many books at a time. So what's the answer? Well, the solution is simple, my friend. More authors equal more money. And by the early 90s, this was a mass-produced fantasy machine, and fans were eating them up despite some of the starts and stops in quality. Now, I in no way want to say that it's a bad thing that there are so many books in the series. Now, I know for some people it can be off-putting and intimidating, but for others, this is a dream come true. If you're curious about a certain race, time, hero, even villain, I promise there is a book out there somewhere for you. There are anthologies, short stories, choose your own adventure books, you name it, it's here. Sometimes there'll be minor characters that were mentioned in the mainline series that would get entire spin-off books. And I had a whole heap of these growing up, up, and I think if I had to choose my hipster pick of the batch, it probably would be the Doom Brigade, and I'd be curious to know what yours is. And there are truly great works from authors like Richard Knack, with another shout out to The Legend of Huma, which is everything a good Dragonlance novel should be distilled into one piece, and actually went on to become its own bestseller. Now sure, although a lot of authors took up the Dragonlance mantle, make no mistake, this was Weiss and Hickman's baby, and throughout the years they continued to write kind of the main books in the series that would substantially move the world forward, while usually other authors would fill in more niche details of the world. But with hundreds of books in the setting, where do you even start? Well, there's no right or wrong answer, but I mean there kind of is a right answer. You have to start with the first trilogy, the Dragonlance Chronicles. These books introduce the core characters, concepts, gods, and factions, and you'll kind of be lost without them. After that, the next obvious move is to the Legends trilogy. And once you get that core foundation, the rest of the library is your playground. Sure, you could try to read all 200 Dragonlance books in chronological orders, and if you do, I salute you. Paladine himself will descend from the heavens and hand you your very own digital Dragonlance. If you want to try to do this, I'll link some guides below, but honestly, it's usually not recommended. Starting at the beginning can spoil major events, and you'll end up bouncing between different authors, series, and timelines, and that's not even counting the time travel shenanigans. So there's just a lot, and on top of that, not everything is even canon. Even Weiss admitted it's tough keeping track of the lore purely because of the sheer volume of what's been written. So don't stress, no one actually knows all of Dragonlance, even the creators of Dragonlance. But that all being said, that is kind of part of the charm. It's like this beautiful, chaotic tapestry, threads weaving in and out, overlapping, and occasionally just unraveling entirely, and there's nothing else quite like it. Now, if you do want a really solid guide to reading all the books, I would definitely check out Zivlin's Naval on YouTube. They've got a great breakdown of the entire thing, and I'll link this below. Now, of course, everything hasn't been smooth sailing. Weiss and Hickman's success with Dragonlance led to trouble with TSR because the company reportedly tried to treat them like regular employees despite, being best-selling authors. And unsurprisingly, the duo pieced out in 1987 after they got other offers and realized just how much they should be making, and they would go on to publish the Dark Sword series with Bateman. Now, needless to say, fans were not exactly happy. TSR passed the torch to a new generation of storytellers with the launch of the Fifth Age, and at the center of that was Gene Raby, who would become the face of the Dragons of New Age trilogy, and whoo boy did that spark controversy, because TSR was essentially trying to push Dragonlance forward without its original authors. A lot of readers hated the new cast, and that's not even to mention the changes within the game system itself, which is a separate conversation we'll get to. Now, Weiss and Hickman did eventually return in the 2000s, but whether due to franchise fatigue, uneven quality, or just the natural lifespan of a massive IP, it kind of seemed like the golden age of Dragonlance was starting to fade. Now, speaking of the mid-2000s, yeah, after the soaring success of the books, you can bet your sweet dragon tushy they tried to turn Dragonlance into a full-blown multimedia franchise. And that of course meant a movie tie-in. And at first this did sound promising because Weiss and Hickman were actually involved, co-writing the screenplay, and even had a little cameo in the tavern scene, which all sounds great, right? Well, calling it great would be generous. It was a direct adaptation of the first book, but instead of that being a strength, it kind of tanked it. The plot moves at an absolute breakneck speed, trying to cram the entire novel in a 90-minute runtime. Now, fascinatingly enough, originally this was supposed to be live action, but the budget just wasn't there. So instead we got this bizarre blend of 2D animation and janky early 2000s CGI. The dragons looked especially special, and this thing was, and to this day, absolutely decimated by critics, like obliterated. But I don't want to be too harsh here. It was clear they made this on a shoestring budget, and there's something kind of endearing about it. And they somehow managed to land some shockingly big names for the voice cast. Now, if you thought the movie drama was the end of Dragonlance's adaptation woes, oh no, buckle up. There was actually a serious push to turn Dragonlance into a TV series spearheaded by none other than actor Joe Manganiello. And he is a huge card-carrying D&D nerd and was apparently super passionate about this project and reportedly worked very closely with Weiss and Hickman to get it off the ground. And by all accounts, he had a vision. Quote, "What I had planned for the first season was mind-blowing. I wanted to make the Dragonlance show because I wanted to see it. The characters, the casting, I have a lookbook with over 1,000 pages. The design concepts I had for the worlds, for the armor, the swords, even the dragons was going to be like nothing anyone had ever seen. Unfortunately, the whole thing stalled out, partly due to Hasbro, which owns Wizards of the Coast, selling off their entertainment arm. That, combined with the underwhelming performance of the 2022 5e release, led to the studio pulling the plug, which is heartbreaking because you can really tell that this was his passion project, and he even went as far as to offer to buy the rights to Dragonlance from Hasbro. Now, I know all the adaptation drama might sound a bit depressing, but don't worry, it hasn't been all bad news for Dragonlance adaptations. There have been some pretty cool comics over the years that are worth checking out, with the first one being done by none other than DC Comics, who launched a series in 1988. Now, this ran for 34 issues, and the art style is charmingly retro, but it does have this certain nostalgic charm, even if it's a little over the top at times. But honestly, it's fascinating to see the world of Dragonlance through that lens, even if it's a bit vintage. And we can't forget about the more recent comics. In the early 2000s, Dragonlance got a fresh batch of adaptations, including The Legend of Huma, which took on a darker, more stylized approach. Now, one area that Dragonlance adaptations really exploded, almost surprisingly, was in video games, and almost all of these came out in the early 90s. Released in 1988 and 1989, Heroes of the Lance and its sequel Dragons of Flame were based on the original books and had this awesome side-scrolling action gameplay. Now, you could of course play as the iconic party including Tannis, Flint, Sturm, and more, but only one hero could appear on screen at times, so they kind of acted more as additional lives. Now, this was considered a decent game for its time, but the game was notorious for its punishing difficulty. I mean, this thing is brutal. Now, in a completely and utterly different direction, we got Dragon Strike in 1989, and this was a flight simulator of all things, where you could soar through the skies while riding a dragon. Developed by Westwood Studios, which were the same people by Command & Conquer, you got to admit that there aren't many fantasy flight sims out there, and this was pretty much Rogue Squadron, but on dragons, which is awesome, right? Now, there was also an NES version, which took a slightly different approach and leaned more into a scrolling shooter vibe. And you best believe we are nowhere near done, because there was yet another Dragonlance game released in 1989, again called the War of the Lance, and this was a turn-based strategy game, and if you kind of squint your eye, it kind of resembles an early primitive version of Total War. Basically, you take turns building armies, fighting enemies, and even creating and breaking alliances. Unfortunately, the graphics are pretty bare bones, so you kind of have to use your imagination to fill in the blanks. Still, there are just not enough strategy D&D games out there, so I'm just happy that this thing exists. Now, released in 1991, we got Shadow Sorcerer, which emphasized real-time combat and strategy, and had two gameplay modes, one as a world map and another as a tactical mode where battles were fought from an isometric view. And it's kind of a fascinating insight into the early development of strategy games, and you can definitely see the bones of what would later evolve into the CRPG genre. Then we got the Krynn series, including Champions of Krynn, Death Knights of Krynn, and the Dark Queen of Krynn. Released in 1990, these games allowed players to create their own party at the end of the last home and embark on your own dungeon crawls, and you could even transfer your party between games, which is pretty sweet. And that was actually it. And it's kind of heartbreaking that after this explosion of Dragonlance games in the early 90s, the franchise kind of fizzled out in the gaming world, and there haven't been any modern takes on these games. Dragon Strike especially deserves a modern open world version where you can imagine flying on the back of dragons and dueling other dragon riders, which would be sweet, right? But with the success of Baldur's Gate 3, it feels like we might get some more D&D games, and maybe we'll get some set in Krynn. Now, while Dragonlance is probably best remembered for its mountain of novels, we cannot forget about the other half of its legacy, which is the actual tabletop setting. And let me tell you, it had almost as many publications, modules, source books, and if you stacked every Dragonlance novel and every piece of game material next to each other, you would probably have enough content to fill a library or possibly bury a Gully Dwarf. And this was one of the things that made Dragonlance such a big deal at the time, was how it merged the novels and game modules together in a way that no one had really done before. Dragonlance wasn't just a setting you read about, you could actually play through its most iconic moments. Chronicles Trilogy wasn't just a story, it was the campaign. You played it at the table, and then you could read the novel version of how it all shook out, or vice versa. This was the dawn of the metaplot, a sweeping narrative arc that spanned multiple books and game products. And yes, it was divisive. Some players loved the structures, others hated it for being railroaded into reenacting stories with pre-generated characters, but love it or hate it, it worked. Dragonlance was successful and basically invented the long-form D&D story arc, and you can still see its influence today in settings like Forgotten Realms or Ravenloft. So yeah, this all kicked off with the original Dragonlance Adventure sourcebook, which came out in 1987 and was the official rules. If you wanted to really understand how Krynn worked, this was your Bible. Then in 1992, the Tales of the Lance box set came along and became the definitive setting guide for many fans. You got gorgeous maps, a deep timeline, and tons of crunchy details to sink your teeth into and to make it feel like a living, breathing world. Now, not everything was smooth sailing, and get used to me saying that about Dragonlance. Weiss and Hickman weren't thrilled with how the early modules forced the books to follow certain beats. So for future series, they flipped the process. Novels came first, then the adventures. But even with some of the bumps in the road, Dragonlance was booming, and the early days of the sourcebook was kind of the golden age for this setting. But then things got weird. In the late 90s, TSR was in financial freefall, and in the middle of the chaos, they tried something way different. They ditched the traditional D&D system altogether and went for a brand new saga system, a completely new rule set that replaced dice with cards and leaned heavily into narrative storytelling, and was seemingly heavily inspired by Vampire the Masquerade. Now, this was ambitious, weird, possibly ahead of its time, and honestly not the worst thing ever, but it understandably confused a lot of longtime players, and as you can imagine, let's just say it together, it was divisive. Between the unfamiliar mechanics, major lore shakeups, it just never caught on, and today it's mostly remembered as a noble misfire, but it is still some people's favorite, and it did have some great products in its own right. But despite all of that, and pumping wild idea after wild idea left and right, by 1997, TSR finally went under, and Wizards of the Coast, everyone's favorite company, bought D&D. Now, you think Dragonlance would get a fresh coat of paint in the new edition, but nope. When 3rd edition dropped in 2000, Wizard didn't plan to support it. But after fan support and pushing from Weiss herself, there was eventually some material for 3.5, and some of it is great, including the 3E campaign setting book, which is an absolute gem. And it's good we got so much in 3E because unfortunately 4E didn't get any Dragonlance love, and it really looked like there was going to be no more movement on Dragonlance because D&D as a whole at that time started to go into a bit of a slump. But things slowly changed. In the mid-2010s, Dungeons & Dragons started clawing its way back into the mainstream, and Wizards took notice and slowly started to dust off some of their older beloved settings, and yes, Dragonlance finally got a seat back at the table. In 2022, Wizards released Shadow of the Dragon Queen, a 5th edition adventure set during the War of the Lance, and it wasn't just a throwaway tie-in either. The book is gorgeous, full of this really cinematic art and high-stakes storytelling, although criminally everyone's favorite Greco-Roman-esque minotaurs with a superiority complex weren't a playable race, and reviews were definitely mixed on this from the fandom, and you kind of get the impression that sales were not great. On the bright side, it came complete with its own companion board game, Warriors of Krynn, which is surprisingly good. It's a cooperative battle game, and the designers apparently really wanted to lean into the war aspect of Dragonlance, and it's way better than it has any right to be. So sure, while Shadow of the Dragon Queen was met with some excitement by fans, it's important to mention that not everyone was thrilled, most notably Mama Weiss and Daddy Hickman. To understand why, we kinda need to rewind a bit, because the road between Dragonlance's original creators and D&D's current stewards has been, well, let's say rocky. Now, when Wizards started digging through their old IP vault and rediscovered Dragonlance to bring it back for 5e, things initially seemed promising. Weiss and Hickman were apparently approached to work on a new trilogy of novels, and contracts were signed and everything was apparently good to go. But somewhere in the editing phase, things reportedly got messy. Concerns were raised by Wizards about the manuscript's handling of issues like race and gender, and Wizards allegedly tried to kill the project altogether. And you best believe that Weiss and Hickman were having none of it. In 2020, they sued Wizards of the Coast, claiming that the company had breached their contract and effectively torpedoed two finished novels. Now, to be fair, the details are fuzzy, and it's difficult to know exactly what went down, but in 2021, Weiss and Hickman voluntarily dismissed their lawsuit. And a year later, in 2022, Dragons of Deceit, the first book in a brand new trilogy, was officially released. So yeah, something clearly got worked out. Still, the relationship seemed tense, with Weiss publicly criticizing Shadow of the Dragon Queen. Quote, "They didn't ask for any consultation. They didn't even tell us they were doing it. It is a vision of Dragonlance that has no connection to ours." End quote. Oof. So where does that leave us in 2025? Well, the duo wrapped up the Dragonlance Destinies trilogy in 2024, and they're apparently not slowing down, and announced yet another Dragonlance trilogy set to begin in 2026 called Dragonlance Legacies, which will be a prequel saga following the good old iconic Huma. But as far as the game side of things, it's not looking so sunny. There's been no news of additional Dragonlance modules, and after the rocky rollout of Shadow of the Dragon Queen, it's likely we might not get any. But don't think for a second that Dragonlance is dead, because even if Wizards of the Coast has moved on, the fandom absolutely hasn't. In fact, 40 years after it was first published, Dragonlance Chronicles made its way back onto the New York Times bestseller list, which is not exactly something you'd expect from a series supposedly past its prime. And while official releases may be few and far between, the fan community is very much alive. Take Dragonlance Nexus, for example, which is a long-running fan site that's practically an institution at this point. It hosts articles, forums, a podcast, fan projects, and even full conversion guides and incredible products like Tasselhoff's Pouches of Everything. And that is just scratching the surface. There have been multiple Dragonlance MUDs over the years. That's Multi-User Dungeon for you post-2000 baby, which is a text-based online games where players type commands to explore, fight, roleplay, and shape stories together. Now, a few of these, like Ansalon.net and Kryn, are still running. And on top of that, over the years, there's been various metal songs inspired by Dragonlance, which I cannot express how much I love that those exist. And even now, if you scroll through Reddit, you'll find gorgeous fan art, Lego builds of the Inn of the Last Home, and yes, mountains of fan fiction. And of course, even entire YouTube channels dedicated to it, like the incredible Dragonlance Saga channel. And all of it goes to show that despite being nearly 4 decades old, Dragonlance still has this strange enduring pull. And the question is, of course, why? Well, I think part of it is the shared universe. These days, sprawling multimedia franchises are everywhere, but back in the 80s, this kind of cross-platform storytelling, novels, modules, art, lore was revolutionary. And Dragonlance turned into not just a product, but a living and breathing world. And Weiss even once said that Dragonlance became not just her world, but everyone's world, which is a really charming sentiment and probably one huge reason that the series has been as long-lasting as it has been. Now, sure, people love to dunk on Dragonlance. It's derivative, it's formulaic, it's full of cliches. Say what you will about tropey settings, they have their place. They're warm and inviting. You know an elf will be an elf, you know good will win. You've been on 100 quests with these characters through time and even the abyss. It's comforting, cozy, and static in the best possible way, like returning to the Inn of the Last Home and having a nice big plate of those steamy spiced potatoes. Dragonlance just fills that cozy fantasy niche. So in conclusion, for all you knights out there, always remember the measure. And more importantly, never ask a Gully Dwarf to count to 3. Huge shout out to Crom Smash for helping me tremendously with fact checking, and another gigantic shout out to my patrons who make this channel possible. I could not do it without you, and if you want to find out more ways to support me and join us on Discord and get linked to some Patreon exclusive videos, you can check out how to support in the link below. As always, if you ever have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, please drop a comment. It's always really interesting to hear what you have to say. Anyway, thanks so much. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.